Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Ed Frauenheim, who's co-written 4 books, including Good Company, Business Success in the Worthiness Era, Organized Innovation, a Blueprint for Renewing America's Prosperity, and Ed's latest book, Reinventing Masculinity, the Liberating Power of Compassion and Connection. It tells the story of the shift from an outdated, unhealthy, confined definition of masculinity to a liberating version of manhood that frees men and all those around them to live fuller, healthier, and more soulful lives at work and beyond. Welcome to the podcast, Ed.
Thanks so much, Charles. It's an honor to be here with you.
Great. I love to always start out with just giving our listeners more of a background around you and kind of what got you into this topic.
I got motivated to write this book, co-write this book with my co-author, Ed Adams, with a combination of personal, professional, and public reasons, you could say. You might notice I like alliteration. That'll come up a couple times in the interview. But the personal reasons were that I struggled growing up to be a man, to be the kind of man that society seemed to want us to be. I'm 56 today. And, growing up, as opposed to that vision of men as strong and stoic and kind of in charge, I was skinny. I lost my one fist fight in 6th grade. I was pretty emotional, sensitive as a young man, as a kid, and then as a young man. And, I never really won that championship game. And then in the work world, I've had a lot of successes, you could say, but I also didn't rise up the corporate ladder. My management career is probably the shortest in history. I've managed one person for one day. So that's a little bit of an idiosyncrasy that I think speaks a lot about my challenges, fitting into that mold of an ideal man. Professionally, meanwhile, I was writing about leadership and about how the best workplaces in the world and the best leaders are showing up today. And I was noticing that those older ways of being like the barking boss, kind of angry guy in the corner office weren't really as successful anymore, even if they ever were successful. And we needed to show up with different qualities that had much more to do with persuasion, empathy, warmth. And so this is where I paired my expertise in kind of workplace and leadership culture, having studied these topics, with Ed Adams, who came from the psychological perspective of what was really healthy for men and their own psyches. And then we both share this public belief that we have to change the way we show up as men and the way we think about ourselves as men if we're going to solve some of the global crises we're experiencing, ranging from political polarization to world conflicts to global warming. And we need to think about ourselves as more interconnected and part of a global community. And that's going to take some new ideas about how to be men.
Well, thank you for sharing. And I agree in building a more inclusive workplace, really needs to start or it needs to include those men in the workplace, right? We talk about a lot of the other non-dominant groups, but really we can make a lot of positive changes and inroads in becoming more inclusive in what we're doing. And like you say, for a long time, many men in leadership positions have tried to be like Superman. They've been drawn to those qualities that are, pretty cool, right? The Man of Steel, he's strong, he's confident, he's invincible and able to save the day all by himself. But in a flatter, fairness-focused world that's taking shape today, we likely need a new model for how men lead organizations, one that moves them from trying to be the men of steel into a man of teal. Could you unpack that metaphor a little bit more? And
Yeah.
I love that metaphor and that approach.
Thanks so much, Charles. Yeah, the Man of Teal concept is something that builds on this idea that there is such a thing as a teal organization and a teal consciousness level. It's part of a color scheme to think about workplace cultures coming out of the book from about a decade ago called Reinventing Organizations. This is not a coincidence that we named our book Reinventing Masculinity. This is the idea that we have evolved as human beings over the several thousand years from like red organizations for more like gangs fighting each other to yellow ones that were more like very strictly hierarchical ones about authority and fitting in like the church or some universities, to orange, which is the kind of capitalistic, very competitive meritocracy kind of ideas. And then you go to The teal, and it's sort of like building on performance, but it's also saying we can be more inclusive such that everybody has a voice and actually has power. There's this idea of self-managed teams as opposed to being kind of told what to do from a chain of hierarchy and bosses at the top. So it's more trusting people to do their thing and do their work. It's also the teal concept is also about wholeness and bringing our whole selves to work. That means whatever identities we have, maybe we're queer, or maybe we are introverts, or maybe we have a strong spirituality that we can start tapping into more. And finally, it's about being really purpose driven and not just being about can we just maximize profits or revenue. It's about saying what can we do to elevate the human condition to in these days solve global problems like climate catastrophes, like high levels of inequality. So this idea of the self-management, of the holism, of the evolving sense of purpose, you add that all together, and what if you talk about a teal consciousness and a teal masculinity, it means more like that idea of listening more rather than telling people what to do. It involves being a bit more intuitive and spiritual than we historically have let ourselves be as men. And it's really knowing that we're interconnected. Connections help us rather than trying to be that isolated rock, that self made man.
So one good example of a man of teal, in my view, is Chuck Robbins. He's the CEO of Cisco, the giant computer and data networking company. And when he took the reins of Cisco several years ago, he had a dream. It was a dream of him visiting a homelessness encampment in San Jose, California, right in the heart of Silicon Valley. And in the dream, he saw his minister and his father. And that kind of spoke to him at a deeply soulful level. And he woke up the next morning and said, I've got to get involved in solving this homelessness problem, which is a real problem throughout California. So he called up politicians and civic leaders and said, what can I do to help? And that sparked an outpouring of philanthropy, involvement, tens of millions of dollars of commitment on the part of Cisco's part, and employees around the world upping their game in terms of what they were doing to give back to the community. And to me, it's a sign that Chuck was not being that sort of strictly business. I'm just about the numbers. I'm just going to get the performance of Cisco up. I'm connected to the community. I'm going to listen to what my spirit tells me, and I'm going to do what's right. And it didn't come at the expense of business success. In fact, the business success increased under his leadership. And employees were giving their best for an inspiring leader. So this is what a man of teal can do, and it's why I think we're called to become those men. They're softer men in a way, but there's real strength in that softness. As a friend of mine, Tori, recently was pointing out. So I give credit to those kind of leaders, and I think more and more of us are being called to explore this idea of going from the man of steel to the man of teal.
I love hearing that explanation and that shift, right, from Superman's dominant traits to a man of teal that resonate more with today's workplace for that need for emotional authenticity and collaboration. And you describe today's kind of emerging business climate with 3 F's, right? It's imperative for leaders, especially for male leaders, to understand and adapt to this faster, flatter, and fair-focused environment. Why do you think that's the climate that's emerging today?
This faster one speaks to the disruption that we're experiencing. A lot of it has to do with technology, AI rising, and suddenly we were not sure what kind of jobs are safe from computers taking over different work tasks, including my territory as being a writer, and do I have a future if computers can write better than me? And it also speaks to how businesses are experiencing threats and opportunities so quickly that they can't rely on older ways of operating, where everyone would funnel information up to the top, where typically a guy, would make a decision and then tell his minions what to do. Now you need to have everybody throughout the organization sensing and responding to what's possible or what's potentially a real problem. And that's why organizations are also getting flatter. The second F is tied in here. We're moving to more shared authority in organizations. We're developing more ad hoc teams where people from across the organization are coming together for a project, often an innovative project where you want those different perspectives to blend together and spark new ideas. And when you have those kinds of teams, it's not really the case that you can be that boss that telling when people what to do. It's about persuasion and creating psychological safety. That's the term that you were speaking to a little bit with the emotional intelligence. When people feel safe to bring their ideas to the fore, be them their full selves, that's when the best performance happens. You could say that caring more than scaring is what triggers the best performance today. And then the fairness focused, you talked about it earlier on, this call for inclusivity and this notion that we've got to make space for everybody. And this is calling on men to not necessarily feel like we're the bad guy. We can often feel like we're the bad guy in this moment, but it's not asking us to step out of the picture, but so much as to see that we've had a lot of advantages. And we may have worked hard, but others have had to work harder. And it's time for us to sort of like be allies, help other voices be heard. And what I think is the case, it's not just that there are new pressures on us, but there are new possibilities because we can have a richer, more satisfying career and, work life when we can see that we are supporting others grow, not just focused on our own advancement.
Wonderful. And I would agree with you. Your approach liberates men from this confined traditional approach of masculinity, and it's based on a 5C approach on evolving masculinity with this new framework. And if you could just unpack those 5Cs, maybe just maybe go into one or two of them a little bit deeper.
Yeah, the 5Cs that we talk about are curiosity, courage, compassion, connection, and commitment. And I think that I'll home in on the two that we put in our subtitle as maybe the most important and maybe the most difficult for men: compassion and connection. And when we say compassion, we're not talking about the fact that men are heartless, that men don't have compassion, but we're talking about how we need to call forward more of an explicit sense of compassion, a willingness to do caregiving, not just sort of in our actions support the family and be that kind of closed-lipped dad, who just brings home the bacon and then that's all they have to do. No, it's sort of about recognizing we have a role to play in the emotional lives of our families, in the emotional well-being of our teams at work, where we're more emotionally intelligent. Essentially, we're about expressing our own vulnerability, and then we're feeling for other people and doing what we can to alleviate their suffering. That's the difference between compassion and empathy. Empathy is feeling the troubles someone might have. Compassion is adding a step of taking action to try to help matters. And that starts with ourselves, Charles. It's like self-compassion is in some ways the root of that. And we men are often not good at even knowing when we're hurting. We often just kind of suppress it all and it comes out in some really unhealthy behaviors. The second one is that connection piece. And we've talked a bit about men feeling that they have to be self-sufficient. We're told to be that rock, that individual island. Well, it's kind of a false set of guidelines because we're not islands. Everyone needs to be cared for at the beginning of their lives and typically at the end. And so a lot of times in between, we come on with a mother and we're helpless and we try to deny the notion of us being interconnected as people, but it's not true. And so this connection piece is about realizing the power of relationships. And over the last couple of decades, the research, and I'm sure you know this well, like it's so important for our well-being to be in connection and relationship with other people. That's the most important predictor of a healthy, long life from a long Harvard study on well-being and longevity. We know that relationships are critical at work now too. We talked about the psychological safety. So for men to realize we are not islands, but we're really part of an archipelago. We're in relationship and connection with others and to the earth. This is an important step to take that, again, leads to a great richness in our experience when we can lean into these friendships, these relationships, a deeper sense of fatherhood. It's really a promising future, but we really got to do some work to get there.
Wonderful. And that's good to unpack because we want to make sure that this is building that inclusive culture, right? That men have their roles to do, males have their roles to do, rather, in addition to everyone else, so that we are all trying to hopefully move the needle together and moving in that same direction. And for many decades, right? Historically, it's been the extroverted men that have really risen up through the ranks of leadership. They're just better suited based on their qualities. However, today, in a faster, flatter, business-focused world, it calls for more calmness, curiosity, deep connection, self-awareness, excellent listening, and all of these are really superpowers of introverted, not extroverted men. What are some of the ways that we can kind of tap into the superpowers of introverted men in today's workplace?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation here, Charles. Jennifer and I had a great experience interviewing a number of accomplished, quiet leaders, male leaders, and found that they'd had a difficult journey getting to where they got to because of exactly what you were saying, that we've celebrated loudership more than leadership, you could say, that charismatic big voice as opposed to necessarily really leading well. But some of the things we came up with, and these really come out of a lot of Jennifer's research also, especially, are first of all, have conversations about introversion and masculinity, that we have to build some awareness. What is it? We've come a long way in accepting introverts in the workplace and knowing their strengths and realizing we have to celebrate them, from Jennifer's work, from Susan Cain's work, who wrote the book Quiet. But we need to look at that intersection, because male introverts have really had a hard time being dinged almost twice. Because they're supposed to be these strong, loud guys. That's the standard we've had. And so they're quieter men. They're more reserved. They get punished for not being that standard guy and also not being extroverted. So it's a difficult combination for them to deal with. So having conversations about, like, can we have a wider set of expectations for how to be a successful man at work? That's part of it. Second, build some quiet times into your schedule as an organization, or quiet practices. And these include things like devoted time during the week where nobody has meetings, so that there can be some heads down time where introverts thrive when they don't have to be in constant social contact, which drains them of energy. That's the basic definition of an introvert versus an extrovert. Introverts gain energy with alone time. And when they are in social contact, it kind of takes the power of their battery. It gets drained more in those settings. So quiet practices, quiet space. One other practice is having agendas well in advance, so introverts can prepare for what's going to come. They're great at preparing, male introverts and female introverts. But if you hit them with the agenda right at that meeting, they're going to be like trying to be thoughtful about the concept and not necessarily be ready to share their ideas. A third thing that Jennifer and I highlight is tell stories. Highlight those male introverts that have taken on leadership roles at your organization or are on their way to doing so, and how they use their qualities, such as the calmness you mentioned, the good listening skills, the ability to help develop deep relationships along the way. And one other quality we noticed in these male introvert leaders is that we saw that they were often advocates for other historically marginal groups. They were reaching out to employees of different ethnic backgrounds that weren't necessarily having a voice at the table, or they were on the lookout to make sure that women had speaking roles at team events. And perhaps because they have these deeper connections with others, they listen well, they have a sense of responsibility and a sense of, we need to be more inclusive. And so acknowledge those strengths and encourage them, and not just the introverted men, but all men.
One thing you said that I haven't heard before, but I'm going to use it from now on, is that you might inadvertently reward the male or just loudership in group settings over the quieter contributions of introverts. And I think a lot of this can be irregardless of males or females. Introverted leaders are getting more talked about from Susan Cain's work, from Jennifer's work, from your work. They are an integral piece of any business's success, and they're being more rewarded for those qualities that they bring to the table versus just those extroverts.
Yeah, one great example, Charles, and I got to give Jennifer credit for the loudership term. She introduced that to me and had it in one of her books. The idea that when you listen more, you can lead better. It's so common sense, but we kind of overlooked at it. And we spoke to one of the male leaders I'll mention that showed this was Jonathan Holloway. He's the first African-American president of Rutgers University. And he talked about transforming the culture of his senior leadership team at the university, where it had been one of fear and basically being told what to do. It was the implication by the former head of the organization. Jonathan came in and was like, I want to hear everybody's ideas. And people didn't believe him at first. They were like, what's he getting at? And he had to have some of his people that he brought in say, like, he's actually serious. He wants to know what you think so he can weigh all the different perspectives and come to a conclusion that's based on lots of points of view. And so, I think he's doing a great job of showing what that non-loudership leadership can look like. And male introverts are really poised to do that well.
I know part of this framework, this approach really depends on males being able to build their emotional courage. So could you provide us some ways in which they can do that?
I recently told a story in a blog about this, Charles, that had to do with like telling a friend of mine that I felt slighted by them. This emotional courage concept is applying all we know about courage in, say, the physical territory, the financial territory. Like, we're willing to go run into a burning building to save someone. We're willing to try a backflip off a cliff, like my son does at age 20. Or we're willing to bet the farm on some new idea where we'll go big, in those territories. But when it comes to emotional territory, relationship territory, we're less likely to take those brave moves. They'll get vulnerable to each other. And so in this case, my friend had sort of cut me off in a conversation we were having about actually male mental health and suicide levels. And I felt dismissed, and it felt really crummy. And I didn't say anything at the time, but it kind of sat with me. And then I said to him later on, I want to talk to you about this. I felt, belittled by the way you spoke to me. And he said, you know what? I understand that. What was bubbling up for me was I was angry or a little upset with something else you had said earlier. We ended up having this conversation where we came to a deeper understanding of each other's views. It brought us together. It came on a history of this is my buddy Jason Patton and I, of having these kinds of hard conversations. But when you have those conversations in the workplace and in life, it's not easy. It takes a bit of courage because he could have said, well, what's the big deal? Why don't you just grow a thicker skin, buddy? Toughen up, and deal with it. So I made myself vulnerable and he honored that. And when we do that, the possibility for that intimacy, for the depth of relationship, and for productive teams goes up dramatically.
That's so critical with any effective leadership, with any effective communication skills, male or female. This is really important stuff to note, that being vulnerable, showing emotional courage, and speaking up for what you feel is not right, or expressing yourself and hoping that there's a good outcome that results from it. What do you think are some of the key challenges that men face when transitioning from this confined framework of masculinity to becoming a man of teal?
I think one of the first big ones is being ridiculed by other men. That if you're going to go and become soft, you're going to become a sissy. If you head in that territory that moves more toward the softer skills, toward embracing not just that toughness, but rather the emotional courage that we talk about, compassion, connection. These are things that historically have been considered feminine, but really they're part of the human range of capacities. When you think about yin and yang in the Eastern philosophies, there has always been this concept of the strength, the assertiveness, the yang energy, and the yin of receptivity. Yin and yang is not inherently masculine or feminine. It's our birthright as a human being. And so we have to be tough in a way to get untough, because we're going to probably hear it from men. But also, another thing I'll say is sometimes women will try to they will be an obstacle for men making this transition, because women may want men in that older mode. They may expect men to be purely the provider, the protector, the procreator. And when men are are showing up more as parents and more involved in that, typically it's wonderful, but it can be confusing for men in a woman's life to show up in a different way, to even need to cry. It's cognitive dissonance for people expecting that boys don't cry kind of masculinity.
But it's all about breaking that model, that rigid model, and becoming more human in the process, right? How has embracing these teal principles impacted your personal life and professional relationships?
It's been great. To put it in one word, hasn't always been easy. I ended up leaving my job after about 6 years as a director of content, a great place to work. But I wanted to explore, that concept of more democratic, soulful organizations. And with this teal team, I've made some not only amazing friends, but amazing colleagues. I've been able to earn a living doing consulting work, both in this territory of a tealy masculinity, Man of Teal kind of stuff, as well as communications work more generally. One thing that was very satisfying, Charles, I'll say, is I've had an opportunity to speak to the ski lift industry. Of all things, I wouldn't have expected this, but kind of through friends of friends, my buddy Paul Toner got me into the lift management annual conference up in Lake Tahoe, California. We did a session about psychological safety and leadership. And one of the attendees of that session was talking about, yes, psychological safety is important because 2 guys just committed suicide on my team over the last 18 months. And then he got really emotional and he said, F the tough guy show. And that just like hit me like a ton of bricks. We weren't even talking about masculinity at that point. And his awareness that if these guys had felt they could let down their guard, if they could talk to anybody on that team would have talked to them. They loved these two guys. And so since then, the last 2 years, this fellow Jay Rid and I, the man who used those words, we've had a session called F the Tough Guy Show to help that industry let go of some of those macho norms and realize you got to share if you're stressed, if you're burnt out, not only because you could save a life, but you can also save lives in the work world, because it's dangerous work you're doing. And if you're not good mentally in the head, you can end up getting hurt or hurting somebody else.
What advice would you give to male leaders who feel overwhelmed or resistant to shifting these paradigms in leadership?
Take a breath. If you're feeling overwhelmed, let's get calm in the first place. There's almost nothing we do well than when we're in a overwhelmed, anxious state. And I say that from a place of personal experience. I've wrestled with anxiety throughout my life. And even over the last several months, I've had some panic attacks. And I think the next step for me, at least, is to see that even though there are a lot of pressures on us right now as men, there are a lot of possibilities. And the possibilities are to move into this wider, liberating kind of masculinity that makes space for more of ourselves, more of our humanity, and allows us to move from, how we used to show up, which is kind of rigid, cold, and isolated, in a world that's now calling for agility, warmth, and connection. And this newer approach, this Man of Teal approach, this liberating masculinity, allows us to show up in those ways where we are more nimble. We're agile, we're warmer to each other, we're more compassionate, and then including to ourselves. And the connected piece is so valuable also because we know that that's where innovation lies. It's where business success lies if we can do that. So, I think it's to not see this as a zero-sum game and one where we're losing something, but rather we can gain as men, even as everybody else gains.
Wonderful. Very well said. As we wrap up this episode, I always like to end with a call to action. What would you recommend for male leaders or for males to transition from this fixed mindset, this approach of a man of steel into the current version, the Man of Teal?
I would say that I don't want to throw Superman under the bus. It's easy to go into some bad places because we try to be like him. But if we look a little closer, Superman did take time to recharge. He went up to that fortress of solitude, and he would be emotional, kind of, connect with his parents and the guidance that they gave him through those weird crystals. They would show videos or whatever. So I guess my point is to we can be, the best parts of Superman when we explore this teal stuff, this territory where we're going to be more emotionally intelligent and connected to others and vulnerable. We'll end up being stronger than we were before and live a healthier, fuller, more soulful life.
Great. Thank you so much, Ed, for joining me today on the podcast. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Sure. They can reach out to me at LinkedIn, find me there. They can find me on my website at edfrauenheim.com, and happy to connect with folks and explore these topics further.
If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.